That fence comes down by Friday, or I'll have it torn down and bill you for the demolition, the disposal, and $1,000 non-compliance fine. The words, sharp and venomous, sliced through the quiet afternoon air, each syllable dripping with the kind of self-important authority only a true bureaucrat at heart could muster. Standing on my freshly laid sod was Karen, the president of the Oakmont Estates Homeowners Association. She was a woman built like a bulldog, all jowls and condensed fury, clutching a clipboard to her chest as if it were a holy text, granting her dominion over all she surveyed. Her floral print muumuu billowed in the slight breeze, a vibrant, mocking flag planted firmly on my property. My new 6-foot privacy fence, the one I had just spent 2 weekends and a significant chunk of my savings on, stood behind me, its cedar planks still smelling of fresh wood and hard work. It was perfect. It was sturdy. And most importantly, it was built to keep my new rescue dog, a jumpy German shepherd named Duke, who'd had a rough start in life, safe and secure. But to Karen, it was an affront, a declaration of war against her meticulously curated kingdom of beige houses and manicured lawns. My sin, apparently, was a violation of a covenant she seemed to have memorized, weaponized, and was now preparing to use to bludgeon me into submission. The sheer audacity of her threat to enter my property, destroy something I own, and then charge me for the privilege sent a cold, familiar calm washing over me, the kind of stillness that always settled in my gut before everything went sideways, back in the sandbox. If you think that's an insane level of entitlement for a neighborhood busybody, you have no idea how deep this rabbit hole goes. Hit that subscribe button right now and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this plays out. But to understand how we got to that point, with her practically foaming at the mouth on my lawn, you have to understand the beginning. My wife Sarah and I had moved into Oakmont Estates just 3 months prior. After a 15-year career in the Marine Corps, followed by a transition into civilian life as a county code compliance inspector, I was ready for some peace and quiet. Oakmont, with its tree-lined streets and promises of a tight-knit community, seemed like the perfect place to finally put down roots. We bought a modest but solid 2-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac, its main selling point being a large empty backyard that was just begging for a dog and a garden. The HOA was mentioned, of course, presented by the realtor as a benign entity that just made sure nobody painted their house purple or left a rusted-out car on their lawn. The fee was reasonable, and the Book of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CC&Rs, looked like standard boilerplate. I read through it just as I read through every contract and official document that crosses my path. It's a habit you pick up when your life and the lives of your men depend on understanding the rules of engagement down to the last subparagraph. Everything seemed in order. So we signed, we moved, and for the first couple of months, it was bliss. We met a few neighbors, like old Mr. Henderson from across the street, a quiet widower who gave a polite wave but mostly kept to himself. And we met Karen. She introduced herself the day we moved in, arriving with a welcome basket containing a copy of the HOA bylaws and a list of approved paint colors. Her smile was wide but didn't reach her eyes, which were busy scanning our moving truck, our furniture, and the state of our lawn with forensic intensity. She introduced herself not as our neighbor, but as the president of the HOA, a title she pronounced with the gravity of a 4-star general. My initial impression was of a woman who had found her one true calling in the meticulous and unwavering enforcement of trivial rules. I filed her away as someone to be polite to, but to keep at a distance. The fence project was our first big undertaking. After adopting Duke from a local shelter, we knew a secure yard was non-negotiable. He was a sweet dog, but skittish and prone to bolting if startled. So I did my due diligence. I reviewed the HOA CC&RS again, specifically Section 8, Article 4, fencing. It stipulated that fences could be no more than 6 feet high, must be constructed of wood or vinyl, and had to be placed at least 5 feet from any public sidewalk. Simple enough. Then I did what 90% of homeowners never do. I went to the county. I pulled the official plat map from my property to verify my exact property lines. I submitted a formal permit application to the County Planning and Development Office. My own office, ironically, though I submitted it as a private citizen through the public portal. I detailed the materials, the height, the setback from the property line, everything by the book. My permit was approved and issued within a week. I hired a reputable contractor, and we spent a beautiful Saturday setting the posts in concrete. The following weekend, we attached the cedar planks. The result was a handsome, sturdy fence that was a textbook example of code compliance. It was a fortress for Duke and a beautiful addition to our property. I was proud of it. But I had made a critical amateur mistake. I had assumed that following the actual written rules was enough. I had failed to account for the unwritten rule of Oakmont Estates. You must first pay homage to Queen Karen. The first shot across the bow wasn't a public confrontation. It was a piece of paper. It arrived a week after the fence was completed, a crisp white envelope with the Oakmont Estates HOA logo embossed in an offensively cheerful shade of green. Inside, on heavy bond paper, was a formal notice of violation. My name and address were typed at the top, followed by a block of text that managed to be both sterile and condescending. It cited a breach of Section 8, Article 4, the very section I had studied. The violation? Unauthorized fence construction. It demanded immediate removal of the fence and included a fine of $100 for the initial violation, with a warning of an additional $25 fine for each day the fence remained standing. My first reaction was simple confusion. Unauthorized? I had a county permit sitting in a folder on my desk. I had followed the CC and RS to the letter. I picked up the phone and called the number listed for the HOA board, which I knew went directly to Karen's personal line. She answered with a clipped, "Oakmont HOA, Karen speaking." I calmly introduced myself and explained that I had received a violation notice regarding my fence and assumed it was a simple mistake. "There's no mistake, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice turning chilly. "All exterior modifications require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I frowned, flipping through my copy of the CC&Rs. "I've read the bylaws, Karen. It says the committee's approval is needed for things not explicitly defined in the covenants, like paint colors or major structural additions. The fence specifications are clearly defined. I met every single one." A sigh on the other end of the line. The kind a weary teacher gives a particularly dense student. "That's not how we interpret it. The committee, which I chair, by the way, must approve all projects to ensure they maintain the aesthetic harmony of the community." Aesthetic harmony. It was one of those beautifully vague phrases that could mean anything she wanted it to mean. "So even though I followed the written rules exactly," I clarified, keeping my voice level, "I'm in violation because I didn't ask for your personal permission first." "The committee's permission," she corrected, a stickler for the veneer of process. "And yes, you are in violation. You need to submit a retroactive application, which will likely be denied given the aggressive nature of the structure, and pay the accrued fines." The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, the receiver still in my hand, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. The cold calm was back. This wasn't about offense. This was about power. It was about her needing every single resident to bend the knee. I had built my fence using the law and the written rules as my guide. She was operating on the basis of unwritten, arbitrary interpretations that centered on her own authority. The Architectural Review Committee, I would later learn, consisted of Karen and two of her close friends, a rubber stamp for her whims. I walked into the living room where Sarah was reading, a worried look on her face. "What did she say?" she asked. I took a deep breath. "She said we're at war." Sarah's face fell. She was a kindergarten teacher, a nurturer by nature, and the last thing she wanted was conflict with our new neighbors. "Mark, can't we just submit the form? Pay the fine? It's not worth the fight?" I looked out the window at my beautiful solid fence and thought of Duke, finally sleeping soundly in the yard without a care in the world. "No," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "This isn't about a fine, it's about a bully, and I don't negotiate with bullies." That night I didn't sleep. I went down to the dining room, cleared the table, and began to assemble my arsenal. It wasn't made of steel and gunpowder, but of paper, data, and the intricate, beautiful machinery of bureaucratic procedure. Karen had chosen her weapon, the HOA bylaws. I was about to counter with my own, the full, unassailable weight of county and state law. She thought this was her kingdom. She was about to find out it was just a tiny, insignificant fiefdom within a much larger jurisdiction. And I was the guy they sent to enforce the king's laws. That weekend, our dining room table disappeared under a sea of paper. To Sarah, it probably looked like chaos, but to me, it was a battlefield being mapped. In the center, I placed the Oakmont Estates CC and RS, the enemy's playbook. Beside it, I laid out a printed copy of the state's Property Owners Association Act, the higher law that governs all HOAs. Then came my own contributions, the official recorded plat map of our subdivision from the county clerk's office, my building permit application, and the approved permit itself, and a thick binder labeled County Building and Zoning Code. This was my territory. For a decade and a half, I'd learned to navigate complex rules of engagement in hostile territory. For the last 5 years, I'd spent my days navigating the even more complex labyrinth of municipal codes. I knew how to read the fine print. I knew that for every rule, there was a hierarchy of authority, an appeals process, and, most importantly, a set of clearly defined limitations. Karen's power wasn't absolute. It only felt that way to people who didn't know how to challenge it. My first move was to reread the HOA bylaws, but this time with a highlighter and a red pen, cross-referencing every clause with the state act. The gotcha moment came on page 37, in the section on amendments. For an amendment to the CC and ERs to be valid, it required a vote of no less than 2/3 of the homeowners and had to be formally recorded with the County Clerk of Court's office to be legally binding. Next, I examined the Architectural Review Committee, ARC clause she was using as her cudgel. It was vague, granting the committee authority over aesthetic matters. But the State Property Owners Association Act was crystal clear. An HOA's architectural standards must be detailed and specific, not left to subjective or arbitrary whims. Aesthetic harmony wasn't a legally defensible standard. It was a lawsuit waiting to happen. The final piece of the puzzle required a trip to the county courthouse on Monday morning. I took a personal day, telling my boss I had a property issue to resolve. At the Clerk of Court's Records Division, I requested the complete file for the Oakmont Estates development, including the original master covenants and any and all amendments filed since its inception in 1998. The clerk returned with a surprisingly thin folder. I sat at a dusty carrel and compared the official, legally recorded CC and Rs with the welcome basket copy Karen had given me. They were not the same. The official version, the one that held legal weight, had the exact language I remembered about fences. But the clause about needing ARC approval for all exterior modifications? It wasn't there. It had been added to Karen's version, the one she distributed, but it had never been voted on by the homeowners, and crucially, it had never been filed with the county. It was, in legal terms, a fiction. It was a rule she had simply invented and inserted herself. A cold, sharp smile touched my lips. This was it. This was the fatal flaw in her armor. She wasn't just misinterpreting the rules. She was enforcing a rule that didn't legally exist. She was committing fraud. I made certified copies of the entire official file. Back home, I started a new folder, this one labeled Karen. Inside, I placed the certified copies from the courthouse, a snapshot of my approved county permit, and the violation notice she had sent me. Then I began documenting everything. I saved the recording of our phone call. I took time-stamped photos of my fence from every angle. I started a daily log, noting every piece of mail from the HOA, every interaction, every sideways glance from Karen as she drove past my house. My training kicked in. Document everything. Assume nothing. Build a case so airtight that by the time you present it, the outcome is a foregone conclusion. The fines kept coming, of course. A new envelope every few days. First $100, then $125, then $150. The daily penalty was escalating. I didn't open them anymore. I just slipped them, unopened, into the Karen folder. It was a stack of blank ammunition she was firing at a fortified position. While I was building my case, I was also conducting reconnaissance. I started taking Duke for long walks around the entire neighborhood, my phone in my pocket. I wasn't just looking, I was seeing. I saw the peeling paint on the house of one of the board members, a clear violation of the maintenance clause. I saw an unapproved basketball hoop, rusted and leaning, in the driveway of the board's treasurer. And then there was Karen's own property, a veritable cornucopia of minor and not-so-minor infractions. Her mailbox was a non-standard design, a whimsical lighthouse that clearly violated the uniform mailbox provision. She had a small, unpermitted shed tucked away behind her house, partially visible from the street. Her prize-winning rose bushes, which she bragged about in the community newsletter, had grown over the public sidewalk, a direct violation of both HOA rules and county ordinances regarding public right-of-way. I took photos of it all, discreetly. Each picture was a piece of evidence, not just of her violations, but of her hypocrisy. She was a tyrant who held her subjects to a standard she herself refused to meet. This was no longer just about defending my fence. It was about dismantling a corrupt regime. The initial anger had subsided, replaced by a methodical, patient resolve. Karen thought she was in a shouting match with a disobedient homeowner. She had no idea she was in a chess match with an expert, and I was already 5 moves ahead. She was bringing a clipboard to a war of legal attrition, and I was just getting started. Karen, predictably, did not appreciate my silence. My refusal to engage, to beg for forgiveness, or to remove my perfectly legal fence seemed to enrage her more than any argument could have. The daily fines continued to accumulate in my evidence folder, but that was no longer enough for her. She needed a public demonstration of my non-compliance. She needed to make an example of me. The escalation came during the annual Oakmont Estates community picnic. It was held in the small park at the center of the subdivision. Sarah had convinced me to go, arguing that we needed to show we were part of the community, not hostile outsiders. Just be nice, as she'd pleaded. Kill her with kindness. I agreed to try, but I brought my phone, its recorder app primed and ready on the home screen. We were standing by the dessert table, making awkward small talk with a couple from the next street over, when Karen made her move. She marched across the lawn with the determination of a Panzer division, her 2 board member cronies, a thin, nervous woman named Carol, and a portly, red-faced man named Bob, trailing in her wake like pilot fish. "Mr. Johnson," she boomed, her voice carrying across the entire park. Conversations dwindled. All eyes turned to us. This was a deliberate, public shaming. "I see you've chosen to ignore the HOA's directives." I took a slow bite of my brownie, chewing thoughtfully before I answered. "I've received your letters, Karen, yes. And your fence is still standing," she said, stating the obvious. "A flagrant disregard for the rules that hold this community together. Your fines are now over $500 in case you weren't aware." "I'm aware," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I could feel Sarah tense beside me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw old Mr. Henderson watching from his seat on a park bench, his expression unreadable. "It's a shame," Karen continued, turning her address to the small crowd of onlookers. "A real shame when one person decides their own selfish desires are more important than the property values and aesthetic integrity of the entire neighborhood. This fence is an eyesore. It's not in keeping with the open, friendly feel of Oakmont. It's a legal, permitted, 6-foot cedar fence," I stated, not to her, but to the audience she was trying to sway. "Built to keep my family and my dog safe." "Your dog," she scoffed, as if the very idea was offensive. "We have leash laws for a reason, and we have architectural standards for a reason. Rules are what separate us from chaos, Mr. Johnson. Perhaps you've forgotten that." The dig referencing my military background, which she'd learned about from the community newsletter, was a low blow, and it was calculated. She was trying to paint me as some kind of rogue element, a loose cannon who didn't respect order. It was a profound miscalculation. Order, rules, and procedure were the very things I was using to build her cage. "I believe in rules, Karen," I said, my voice dropping into that calm, low register that always made my Marines stand a little straighter. "I believe in them so much that I follow the ones that are actually written down and legally filed with the county. You should try it sometime." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. Her face, which had been flushed with righteous indignation, tightened. I had just publicly called her out, questioning her authority in front of her subjects. It was a direct challenge she could not abide. Your insolence is duly noted, she hissed, her voice low and menacing now. This is your final warning. The board has voted to pursue all available remedies, including placing a lien on your property for the unpaid fines and hiring a contractor to remove the offending structure at your expense. Bob and Carol nodded dutifully behind her, their expressions a mixture of fear and sycophantic agreement. She spun on her heel and marched away, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. The picnic was effectively over. People started gathering their things, casting nervous glances our way. The couple we had been talking to gave us a weak, apologetic smile and scurried off. We were pariahs. On the walk home, Sarah was silent, her hand trembling slightly in mine. "Maybe we should just take it down," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I can't live like this, Mark, with everyone hating us." I stopped and turned to her, taking both of her hands in mine. "They don't hate us, Sarah. They're scared of her. There's a difference. Did you see their faces? They weren't looking at us with anger. They were looking at us with pity, because they know exactly what she's like, and they're just glad it's not them." I guided her to our front porch and we sat on the steps. I looked at our house, our yard, and the fence standing tall and proud. "I spent 15 years fighting for things I believe in," I said softly. "I'm not going to come home and surrender my own backyard to a petty tyrant with a clipboard. This is our home. We're not giving up 1 square inch of it." I pulled out my phone and played the last 5 minutes of the conversation I had recorded. The quality was crystal clear. Karen's public threat to place a lien and tear down my property was now documented. "This isn't just a neighborhood squabble anymore," I told Sarah, adding the audio file to my digital evidence folder. "She's escalating, and so are we." The public humiliation wasn't a defeat. It was a tactical victory. She had shown her hand, revealed the depths of her vindictiveness to the entire community, and given me a beautifully recorded piece of evidence of her harassment and intent. The war was no longer being fought in the shadows or through letters. She had brought it out into the open, and now I could finally start recruiting. The day after the picnic, the atmosphere in the cul-de-sac was thick with unspoken tension. Neighbors who used to offer a friendly wave now averted their eyes, scurrying inside as I walked Duke. They were afraid of being seen as allies, of becoming Karen's next target. I knew I couldn't win this alone. I needed to break through that wall of fear. My first target was the one person who hadn't scurried away, Mr. Henderson. I'd seen him at the park, watching the confrontation with an interest that seemed more than just casual curiosity. He'd lived here since the beginning. If anyone knew where the bodies were buried, it was him. I waited until I saw him out front, meticulously tending to his rose bushes, the ones that, unlike Karen's, were perfectly trimmed and clear of the sidewalk. I walked over, leaving Duke in the yard. "Mr. Henderson," I started, "I'm Mark Johnson. I live across the street." He straightened up slowly, wiping his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He was a frail-looking man, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "I know who you are, son," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Saw the show yesterday. She's a piece of work, that one." "That's one way to put it," I said with a slight smile. "I was hoping I could ask you a few questions. You've been here a while, right?" He nodded, leaning on his rake. "Built this house in '99, me and the wife. Been here ever since." "So you were here before Karen was HOA president?" His face darkened. "Lord, yes. It was different then. We had a board, sure, but it was just about keeping the pool clean and planning the 4th of July parade. People were neighborly. Then her husband got transferred here, about 10 years back. She got on the board as secretary. 2 years later, she was president. Been that way ever since. Drove out anyone who disagreed with her." This was the opening I needed. "Mr. Henderson, she's threatening to put a lien on my house and tear down my fence. I built it by the book, got a county permit and everything. She's citing a rule that I can't find in the official covenants filed with the county." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition. I pressed on. "I have a feeling I'm not the first person she's done this to." He was silent for a long moment, studying my face. "You a lawyer?" he asked. "No, sir. I'm a county code inspector, but I'm a fast learner." That seemed to be the right answer. He gestured with his head toward his front door. "Come on inside, son. I've got something you need to see." His house was immaculate, filled with pictures of a smiling woman and what looked like grandchildren. He led me to a small office in the back and pulled a dusty accordion file from the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. He opened it on his desk, and inside were years of correspondence with the HOA. It was a mirror image of my own growing file. There was a violation notice from 5 years ago, fining him for the unapproved color of his front door, which had been the same color for a decade. There was a threat to fine him for his bird feeder, claiming it attracted vermin. There was a letter from 3 years ago, almost identical to the one I received, regarding a small garden retaining wall he had built. It cited the same non-existent rule about needing prior ARC approval. "She made me tear it down," he said, his voice quiet with old anger. "Cost me $200 for the materials. I was going to fight her, but Martha, my wife, she was sick then. I didn't have the strength for a war." He had given in, and Karen had learned that her tactics worked. He wasn't the only one. He gave me two other names: the Millers, a young family who had been fined into submission over a playset for their kids, and a woman named Mrs. Davis, who had been forced to repaint her entire house because Karen decided the shade of beige was half a tone too dark. "She preys on people who won't fight back," Mr. Henderson said, his voice hardening. "Young families who are overwhelmed, old folks like me who are tired. She's a bully." "Not anymore," I said, a plan forming in my mind. "Would you be willing to talk to the Millers and Mrs. Davis? I want to set up a meeting, not here, somewhere neutral. I want to show them what I found." 2 nights later, we gathered in the back room of a small coffee shop in the next town over. It felt clandestine, like a meeting of resistance fighters. There was me, Sarah, Mr. Henderson, the Millers, and a nervous Mrs. Davis. I laid it all out on the table. I showed them the certified copy of the real CC and RS from the courthouse. I showed them the fake version Karen distributed. I pointed out the non-existent rule she had used against all of us. You could feel the mood in the room shift from fear and resignation to shock, and then to a slow-burning anger. "She just made it up?" Mr. Miller asked, his face a mask of disbelief. "She can't do that, can she?" "She can't do it legally," I confirmed. "But she has been, because no one has ever called her on it with proof. Until now." I then showed them my folder, the violation notices, the pictures of the board members' own violations, the audio recording of Karen's public threat. Their eyes widened. They saw that I wasn't just complaining, I had a case, a powerful one. "What do we do?" Mrs. Davis asked, her voice trembling, but with a new edge of defiance. "First," I said, "we form a united front. Each of you needs to write down everything you can remember about your dealings with her. Dates, conversations, copies of letters, records of payments. Give it all to me. We're going to build a comprehensive file documenting a pattern of harassment, selective enforcement, and fraud." Mr. Henderson looked at me, a glint in his eye I hadn't seen before. "And then?" "And then," I said, closing my folder with a decisive snap, "we get a lawyer, and we don't just get the lien and the fines thrown out, we get her thrown out." For the first time in a decade, the residents of Oakmont Estates were no longer isolated victims. We were an alliance. Karen's strategy of divide and conquer had just backfired spectacularly. She had inadvertently created the very thing she feared most, an organized opposition. The following week, armed with a thick binder containing my own meticulously documented case, plus sworn affidavits from Mr. Henderson, the Millers, and Mrs. Davis, I walked into the downtown law offices of Franklin and Associates. Frank Miller, no relation to the family from my neighborhood, a coincidence that felt like a good omen, was a name I'd gotten from a fellow Marine I served with. The recommendation was simple. If you want a bulldog who loves the taste of bureaucracy, Frank's your man. Frank was a man in his late 50s with a handshake that could crush walnuts and the tired, patient eyes of someone who'd seen it all. A framed picture on his desk showed him in his dress blues, a younger man with the same determined set to his jaw. We understood each other before I'd even said a word. "So," he said, leaning back in his leather chair after I gave him the short version, "you've got an HOA president on a power trip. That's about half my caseload. What makes yours special?" I didn't answer. I just opened the binder on his expansive mahogany desk and turned it around for him to see. I had organized it with tabs: fraudulent covenants, evidence of selective enforcement, harassment and threats, audio included, and witness affidavits. He raised an eyebrow, leaned forward, and started to read. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the office was the soft rustle of paper as he turned the pages. He read my analysis of the C, C, and Rs. He looked at the side-by-side comparison of the real and fake documents. He scanned the time-stamped photos of Karen's unpermitted shed and the board treasurer's rusty basketball hoop. He read the sworn statements from my neighbors, detailing years of petty extortion. When he got to the tab for the audio file, I handed him a small USB drive. He plugged it into his computer, put on his headphones, and listened. I watched his expression shift from professional interest to a kind of grim satisfaction. He took the headphones off and looked at me, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Son, this isn't a case. This is a public execution. You've done 90% of my job for me. This is the most well-documented case of HOA malfeasance I've ever seen. So we can fight the lien?" Sarah asked, speaking for the first time from her chair next to me. Frank laughed, a deep rumbling sound. "Honey, we're not going to fight the lien. We're going to shove it down her throat. We're not just defending, we're going on the attack. We have grounds here for a multi-pronged assault." He started ticking points off on his fingers. 1. We file for a declaratory judgment from a judge to rule that the fence is compliant and the fines are illegal and unenforceable. That's the easy part. 2. We file a counterclaim against the HOA board and against Karen personally for breach of fiduciary duty, harassment, and fraudulent misrepresentation. Your neighbor's affidavits establish a clear pattern of this behavior. We'll seek damages for the money they were forced to pay and for emotional distress. 3. We use the provision in the State Act and your own bylaws to formally petition for a special meeting of the homeowners to recall the entire board of directors. With the evidence you have, they'll be crucified. He paused. Sorry, leaning forward with a conspiratorial gleam in his eye. But there's a fourth, more elegant option, the one I like best. You said you are a county code inspector? Yes, I confirmed, and Karen has threatened, on tape, to escalate this to the highest authority to bring in the county to force you to comply. She has, I said, seeing where he was going. Then we let her, Frank said, the smile turning predatory. We don't fire the first legal shot. We bait her into it. You're going to send one more letter to the board. A polite, professionally worded letter that says you consider the matter closed, that your fence is compliant with all legally filed covenants and county codes, and that you will not be paying any fraudulent fines or engaging in further communication on the matter. It will be so calm, so dismissive, it will drive a woman like her absolutely insane. Her ego won't be able to handle it. She'll have to prove she has the bigger stick. And she'll call the county. I finished, the beauty of the trap settling in. She'll call your office to report you. Exactly, Frank boomed, slapping his desk. She will, in her rage, personally invite the fox into her hen house. And what happens then? My supervisor is aware of the situation, I said. I've already briefed him on the potential conflict of interest. We have a procedure for this. To ensure absolute impartiality, the inspector with the conflict of interest, me, is the one assigned to the case, with a supervisor reviewing the findings. It prevents anyone from claiming a colleague did them a favor or an enemy retaliated. It's all about chain of custody and transparency. Frank let out a low whistle. It's better than I thought. It's poetic. She's going to demand an official inspection, and you, her mortal enemy, are going to show up with a badge and a clipboard. You'll inspect your own fence, find it compliant, and then, what? And then, I said, the cold calm feeling perfect and righteous. Since a formal complaint was lodged regarding compliance in the neighborhood, my duty as a county official will compel me to perform a cursory inspection of the surrounding area for any other visible code violations. To be thorough. Frank leaned back and roared with laughter. Mr. Johnson, you are a very, very nasty man. I like that. We're going to let her build her own gallows, and you're going to be the one to hand her the rope. We left his office with a clear plan. The legal paperwork would be drafted and ready to file, but we would hold it back. The first move was Karen's. All I had to do was send the letter and wait for her pride to do the rest. The trap was set. All it needed was for the target to take one more arrogant, self-assured step. The letter Frank drafted was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive professionalism. It was addressed to the HOA Board of Directors, care of Karen. It politely acknowledged receipt of their numerous correspondences. It stated in dry, legalistic language that after a thorough review of the governing documents filed with the county and all relevant municipal codes, I had concluded that my property was in full compliance. It then stated my refusal to pay any fines levied erroneously and without legal basis. The final paragraph was the masterstroke. As this matter is now considered closed, I will not be engaging in further discussion regarding this non-issue. I trust the board will adjust its records accordingly and cease all further contact on this subject. It was the legal equivalent of, "Don't call me, I'll call you." It dismissed her entire crusade as a trivial annoyance. I sent it via certified mail, requiring a signature so I would have proof she received it. The signed receipt came back a few days later, Karen's angry scrawl confirming she had taken the bait. Then silence. For a full week, there were no new fines in the mailbox, no angry drive-bys. It was an unnerving quiet. Sarah started to hope that maybe, just maybe, it had worked. That Karen had read the letter, consulted a lawyer of her own, and decided to back down. I knew better. A woman like Karen doesn't back down. She doubles down. This was the quiet before the storm, the moment she was plotting her ultimate revenge. Confirmation came from my inside source, Mr. Henderson. He called me one evening, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "She called an emergency board meeting tonight," he said. "Carol, the secretary, her husband plays poker with me. He said Carol came home in a tizzy. Karen was waving your letter around, screaming about your unmitigated gall. She told the board she was done with warnings. She was going to bring the full force of the government down on you." It was happening, exactly as Frank predicted. The next day, I received an email at my work address from my supervisor, Tom. The subject line was, "New inspection request, 124 Oakmont Court," my address. The body of the email was brief. "Mark, we've received a formal complaint from a Karen Peterson, president of the Oakmont Estates HOA, regarding a potentially non-compliant fence structure at the above address. Per our discussion and standard procedure for conflict of interest cases, you're assigned as the primary inspector. I'll want a full report for review by EOD Friday. Let me know if you need backup." I typed back a simple reply. "Understood. We'll handle it personally. No backup required." I felt a jolt of adrenaline, clean and sharp. The final pieces were moving into place. This was no longer a personal dispute. This was now an official county matter, initiated by Karen herself. She had taken her little HOA squabble and elevated it to a formal government action. And in doing so, she had handed me all the power. I scheduled the inspection for Friday at 10 a.m. Then I did two more things. First, I sent a brief formal email to Karen from my official county account. "Ms. Peterson, in response to your formal complaint, an official inspection of the property at 124 Oakmont Court has been scheduled for this Friday at 10 a.m. As the complainant, you are welcome to be present. Sincerely, Mark Johnson, County Code Compliance." I deliberately left my title off the signature, using only my name. Let her think I was just some clerk sending a notification. Second, I made a phone call to a local investigative reporter I knew, a guy named Ben, who had a nose for stories about petty corruption and abuse of power. I'd worked with him on a story a year ago about a slumlord, and we had a good rapport. "Ben," I said, "I might have something for you, a little David versus Goliath story in a suburban HOA. But the final scene is playing out this Friday. You might want to have a cameraman parked down the street from 124 Oakmont Court around 10 a.m. No promises, but I have a feeling it's going to be good television." Ben, who loved this kind of story, was immediately intrigued. "I'm there," he said. "What's the angle?" "The angle," I replied, a grim smile on my face, "is what happens when a petty tyrant accidentally calls in an airstrike on her own position." The night before the inspection, I laid out my uniform, a crisp, county-logoed polo shirt, my official ID on a lanyard, and dark gray tactical pants. I polished my boots. It was a ritual, the same one I used to perform before a big mission. Prepare your gear. Prepare your mind. Sarah watched me, her face a mixture of anxiety and awe. Are you sure about this? She asked softly. This feels huge. It is huge, I said, clipping my multi-tool to my belt. She wanted to make an example of me. Tomorrow I'm going to return the favor. I wasn't just fighting for my fence anymore. I was fighting for Mr. Henderson's retaining wall, for the Miller's playset, for Mrs. Davis's house paint. I was a representative of every quiet, decent person who had ever been bullied into submission by a small person with a little bit of power. On Friday morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. It was a beautiful day for a public reckoning. Friday morning at 9:55 a.m., I saw her. Karen was standing on her front porch across the street, clipboard in hand, flanked by her loyal board members, Carol and Bob. She was dressed for victory in another one of her voluminous floral dresses, a look of triumphant expectation on her face. She was a queen awaiting the arrival of her executioner, never dreaming he was coming for her. A nondescript white van was parked 100 yards down the street, Ben the reporter, just as he'd promised. At precisely 10 a.m., I drove my official Ford F-150, complete with the county seal on the doors, around the corner and into the cul-de-sac. I didn't park in my own driveway. I parked directly in front of my house, on the street, the way any inspector would. I watched Karen's face as I got out. She saw the official truck and a broad, smug smile spread across her face. This was it. The cavalry had arrived to vanquish her enemy. She started to walk towards me, her stride full of purpose. I let her get about halfway across my lawn before I turned to face her fully. I put on my sunglasses, clipped my own clipboard to my arm, and looked her straight in the eye. Her smile faltered. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. She was looking at me, Mark Johnson, her insolent neighbor, but I was wearing a uniform she didn't recognize, holding a clipboard of my own, and standing beside a county vehicle. The pieces were clicking into place in her mind, but they were forming a picture she couldn't comprehend. Good morning, I said, my voice calm and official. You must be the complainant, Miss Peterson. I'm Mark Johnson from the County Code Compliance Office. I'm here to conduct the inspection you requested. The transformation of her face was a thing of beauty. It went from smugness to confusion, then to disbelief, and finally, as the full reality of the situation crashed down upon her, to a pale, slack-jawed horror. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. Bob and Carol, standing behind her, looked utterly bewildered. You can't be, she finally stammered, her voice a strangled whisper. There's a mistake. There's no mistake, ma'am, I said, deliberately using the same condescending phrase she had used on me in our first phone call. Your complaint was filed, and I was assigned the case. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to begin the inspection of the structure in question. I turned my back on her, walked over to my fence, and began my official assessment. I pulled out a tape measure. Okay, measuring height from grade, I said, loud enough for her and her stunned cronies to hear. 6 feet. That's compliant with County Code 305.1. I walked the perimeter. Setback from the rear property line is 10 feet, 5 feet from the side, compliant with plat map and zoning regs. I checked the post holes, the material, the gate latch. After 5 minutes of this meticulous, performative inspection, I made a final note on my clipboard. All right, I announced, turning back to the dumbstruck trio. Based on my inspection, the fence at 124 Oakmont Court is 100% compliant with all applicable county and state building codes. It also appears to be in full compliance with the officially recorded covenants for the Oakmont Estate subdivision. I'll be closing this complaint as unfounded. A copy of the report will be mailed to you. I could see the news van slowly rolling closer, the camera now visible in the passenger window. Karen's face was a mottled red mask of fury and humiliation. You can't do this, she sputtered. This is a conflict of interest. I'll have your job. Actually, ma'am, I said, my tone patient, our department has a specific protocol for potential conflicts of interest to ensure impartiality. The assigned inspector conducts the review, which is then validated by a supervisor. It's the most transparent way to handle it. My supervisor will be reviewing and signing off on this report this afternoon. But my work here isn't quite done. I look past her, my gaze sweeping across the cul-de-sac. Your official complaint mentioned concerns about maintaining community standards and ensuring compliance with regulations. When we receive a complaint like that, especially from an HOA president, we have a duty to be thorough. It suggests there may be a pattern of issues. So, I'm now required to do a cursory visual inspection of the immediate area for any other obvious code violations. I started with the house next to hers. Okay, I'm noting an unpermitted deck extension here. Looks like the footings are undersized. I moved my gaze to her own property. Her face went white. And here at the complainant's own residence, I see a few items of concern. That shed in the backyard. I don't see a permit on file for an accessory structure at this address. We'll need to look into that. And these rose bushes are encroaching on the public right-of-way, a violation of Municipal Code 12-5. That's a safety hazard. And is that? Yes, a non-standard mailbox. That's another violation. With every violation I listed, another nail was hammered into her coffin. Her neighbors were starting to emerge from their houses, drawn by the spectacle. Mr. Henderson was on his porch, a slow, wide grin spreading across his face. The Millers were watching from their window. This wasn't just my victory, it was theirs too. I walked over to Bob's house, and here we have a detached garage with unapproved wiring visible. That's a significant fire hazard. Bob looked like he was going to be sick. Karen finally found her voice, a shrill shriek of pure rage. This is harassment. You're retaliating against me. No, ma'am, I said, clicking my pen. This is code enforcement. It's what you asked for. I turned and walked back to my truck, leaving her standing in the middle of my lawn, sputtering and impotent, surrounded by the ruins of her petty kingdom. The trap hadn't just been sprung, it had vaporized her. The fallout was swift and merciless. By that afternoon, my report on the fence was approved by my supervisor, officially and permanently closing the case. But the new cases I had opened, the ones for Karen's illegal shed, her sidewalk blocking bushes, her non-compliant mailbox, and the various violations at the homes of her board allies, were just beginning. Within a week, official county notice of violation letters began to arrive. These weren't friendly green embossed notes from the HOA. These were stark legal documents from the government, printed on intimidating letterhead, detailing the violations and specifying the remediation required. They came with deadlines and, more importantly, substantial civil penalties for noncompliance. Karen's unpermitted shed alone carried a potential fine of several $1,000s, plus the cost of a retroactive permit if it could even be brought up to code, or the cost of demolition if it couldn't. The fines for the other board members were similarly painful. The weapon she had tried to use against me, bureaucracy and fines, had been turned against her with 100 times the force. While the county's gears were grinding, Frank Miller filed our legal salvo. He filed the motion for a declaratory judgment on the fence, a formality at this point, the counterclaim for harassment and fraud against Karen and the board, and the formal petition signed by me, Mr. Henderson, the Millers, Mrs. Davis, and a dozen other neighbors who had come forward after the public spectacle to hold a special meeting to recall the entire HOA board. The news story aired that Friday evening. Ben, the reporter, had done a masterful job. He had the footage of my arrival, of Karen's face collapsing in horror, and of me calmly listing her own violations. He had interviews with a now emboldened Mr. Henderson, who spoke eloquently about the years of petty tyranny. He even got a no comment from Karen as she slammed her front door in his face. The story painted her as a classic neighborhood bully who got a taste of her own medicine. My phone started ringing with calls from neighbors I'd never even spoken to, all offering their support and wanting to sign the petition. Karen's power had been built on a foundation of fear and isolation. By standing up to her and exposing her, I had shattered that foundation. People were no longer afraid. The special meeting for the recall vote was scheduled 2 weeks later in the community clubhouse. The room was packed. It was the best attended HOA meeting in Oakmont history. Karen, Bob, and Carol sat at a table at the front, looking pale and defeated. Karen tried to take control to run the meeting with her usual iron fist, but the crowd wasn't having it. Mr. Henderson, nominated to serve as the meeting's moderator, stood up and calmly took the microphone. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts. He spoke of the fraudulent covenant. He spoke of the selective enforcement. He spoke of the harassment, not just of me, but of his own family, of the Millers, of Mrs. Davis. One by one, other homeowners stood up and shared their own stories, creating a tidal wave of discontent. I never said a word. I didn't have to. I just sat in the back with Sarah, watching the community I had inadvertently galvanized take its power back. When the vote was called to recall Karen, Bob, and Carol from the board of directors, the result was nearly unanimous. A sea of hands went up in favor of their removal. Only 3 hands, their own, stayed down. It was a complete and total repudiation of her reign. Stripped of her title and her power, Karen seemed to shrink. She was no longer the imposing tyrant of Oakmont Estates. She was just an angry, bitter woman in a floral dress. My final confrontation with her wasn't dramatic. It happened a week later in the produce section of the local grocery store. She saw me by the avocados, abandoned her cart, and marched over. "You," she spat, her face contorted with hate. "You ruined everything. This was a good community. It was orderly. You think you're some kind of hero?" I calmly selected a ripe avocado and placed it in my basket. I looked at her, at this woman who had caused so much stress and anxiety for so many people over something so trivial as a fence. I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, just a kind of weary pity. "I just wanted to keep my dog safe, Karen," I said, my voice even. I didn't raise my voice or argue. I just looked at her, held her gaze for a moment, and then turned and walked away, pushing my cart toward the dairy aisle. Her power over me, over everyone, was gone, and the most devastating thing I could do was show her that she no longer mattered. Her angry sputtering faded behind me, lost among the mundane sounds of the supermarket. The war was over. In the weeks that followed, a sense of normalcy, a better kind of normalcy, returned to Oakmont Estates. An interim board was appointed, with Mr. Henderson agreeing to serve as the new president. His first official act was to call a meeting where the board formally voted to void every fine Karen had issued over the past 5 years related to the fraudulent ARC approval clause. They issued formal letters of apology to every family that had been targeted. The Millers even got a check from the HOA, reimbursing them for the cost of the compliant playset they had been forced to buy. The second act was to hire an independent legal firm to conduct a full review and overhaul of the CC&Rs, bringing them into compliance with state law and removing all the vague, arbitrary language Karen had used to her advantage. The community was healing. The cloud of fear that had hung over the neighborhood for a decade had lifted. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had been afraid to make eye contact were now stopping to chat on the sidewalk. The oppressive, enforced conformity of Karen's reign was replaced by a genuine sense of community. Bob and Carol, facing their own county fines and public shaming, quietly sold their houses and moved away within 6 months. Karen held on longer. Her house became a monument to her defeat. The unpermitted shed was torn down, leaving a sad, bare patch in her backyard. Her prize-winning rose bushes were trimmed back aggressively to comply with the county ordinance. Her whimsical lighthouse mailbox was replaced with a standard, boring black one required by the bylaws she had once wielded like a weapon. Every day she was forced to live with the visible consequences of her own hubris. Eventually, about a year after the recall, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. One sunny Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood decided to hold a community restoration barbecue in the park, where Karen had tried to shame me. It was Mr. Henderson's idea. The atmosphere was completely different from that tense, awful picnic a year before. Kids were running around, music was playing, and the air was filled with the smell of grilled burgers and the sound of laughter. I was manning the grill, flipping burgers, when Mr. Henderson came over with 2 beers in his hand. He handed one to me. "Look at this," he said, gesturing around at the happy scene. "This is what a neighborhood is supposed to be. We all owe you for this, Mark." "I didn't do it alone," I said, taking a sip of the cold beer. "You were all just waiting for someone to light the fuse." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, watching our neighbors enjoy their reclaimed freedom. Duke, my German shepherd, was off his leash, happily chasing a frisbee with the Miller kids in the open field. He was safe. He was happy. My fence, the catalyst for the entire ordeal, stood tall and proud in the distance, a simple wooden structure that had become a symbol of something much bigger. Sarah came over and wrapped her arm around my waist, leaning her head on my shoulder. "It's finally peaceful," she said softly. "It was worth it," I replied, looking at her and smiling. The victory wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about the restoration of fairness. It was a lesson, written in county citations and legal motions, that the abuse of even the smallest amount of power has consequences. It was proof that one person, armed with the facts, a bit of discipline, and the courage to stand their ground, can face down a bully and, in doing so, empower an entire community to stand with them. My house was no longer just a property, it was a home. And our neighborhood was no longer a tightly controlled regime. It was a community, finally free to be itself. And it all started because a petty tyrant picked a fight over a fence, not knowing she was challenging the one man whose entire job was to know the rules better than she did.